leadership is not a role, it's a way of being, and anybody in the room can take on that leadership position. If you have an organization of 150 people and there's only one person who's really making the shot, calling the shots, you're missing out on a lot of your intelligence. There's moments of conflict that actually create connection. If you miss those opportunities, then you're missing opportunities to make a richer environment.
Gillian, it's very good to have you here. Thank you so much for taking your time and being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. We enjoy this conversation. We've got a lot of important topics to cover today. You're working at the intersection of leadership, neuroscience, and systems thinking, and I'm really looking forward to exploring all of that with you today. To get started, leadership conversations often focus on strategy, performance metrics, but less attention is given to how people actually process information, how they process stress, how they approach complexity. And as some organizations become more diverse in how people think and they operate, leaders are really being challenged, I think, to rethink about the assumptions about how productivity, communication, and decision-making happens. What does, in your opinion, and from your experience, what does neurodiversity-aware leadership really mean in practical terms?
Well, I think it can mean all kinds of things. And I think that there's a long history of work on inclusion and accommodation in organizations, which is great work that has had great impact. When I think of maybe my experience coming into understanding leadership and neurodivergence really comes from my experience as a parent of a neurodivergent child and experiencing the impact of systems on his experience, really, and the ways in which he is consistently asked to adapt, to be accommodated, to fit into the existing system, which is sort of designed with a dominant style, which we refer to as neurotypical, I think, for the most part. It's designed with that nervous system functioning, that processing and communication modality in mind. And so when I think about neurodiversity aware leadership, I'm thinking about something that's a little bit more personal, relational, nuanced, in the sense of stripping back and really meeting people where they are, understanding what they need to be successful in your organization, in doing their job, and giving space for a dialogue and a relationship to emerge between team members or a supervisor and a staff, so that what is needed to be successful is really clear and well thought out and adapted to the needs of the people on the team. And I think part of this, as a leader, one of the things I've experienced in my organizations is when I would have an issue with a staff member who needed accommodation, often the accommodations that were available to me to offer them as a leader weren't exactly going to help them and the team find success. So I was often faced with this choice between doing something that made sense and breaking the rules, and following the rules and doing something that doesn't make sense, which as a leader is a really uncomfortable situation. And it caused me to really peel back the layers and think about what would it have looked like if we had had a really human conversation about this right from the beginning. And, there's all kinds of offshoots here, but one of the things that comes to me as I say that is often revealing a status of neurodivergence doesn't feel safe in a hiring process or in the beginning of a work experience. And so I think part of the work that I'm doing is trying to create a place where we recognize the strengths that neurodivergent minds bring us in organizations and as we move into facing a complex future, so that people can show up the way that they are, and it's also safe to be who they are. And part of the thing that I think is happening where people who from different non-dominant neurotypes are making a lot of effort to fit into the dominant paradigm, and their unique gifts are not really getting to see the light of day because they're spending so much energy trying to fit in. Mm-hmm. So I'm really curious, and just my experience with my own child and seeing how brilliant he is, mm-hmm. I'm really curious about what it would look like if it was safe and people had enough energy to really bring their unique gifts and their unique perspectives to the table in their organizations. And so I talk about this idea of neuropluralism, which is, neurodiversity explains the existence of different neurotypes. Mm-hmm. Whereas neuropluralism is sort of an ideology that underlines their value and their validity. And so I see that we might be missing a piece of value as we move into a complex future by requiring neurodivergent minds to fit in to a dominant paradigm.
Yeah. And that's a very good point, because I've seen scenarios and environments where both of those kind of aspects were existent, and the ones that were latter, where there was pluralism, where there was freedom, where there was safety. Honestly, it was a much better environment. I myself led people like that, and it just was much more powerful. And so I certainly applaud that statement. That topic of neurodiversity really kind of naturally leads into how leaders actually process pressure and decision making. And much of leadership training that we go through assumes that people can simply choose better behavior under pressure, but that neuroscience suggests that stress responses, cognitive load, and emotional regulation all shape how we actually perform in real time. How does neuroscience reshape the way leaders should think about performance and accountability?
Well, I think it's building on the neurodiversity aware insight there is, I like what you're pointing to in the sense that the way we operate is not necessarily always this sort of black and white. You build a plan, you develop a skill, and then you implement it, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't always work like this. And I think that the nervous system awareness is a very foundational piece in leadership. Often you'll have, and I've had this experience as a leader myself, where you learn some skills and you feel ready to use them. Mm-hmm. But then it comes time to, say, implement this new tool for nonviolent or compassionate communication in a room with your team. And you can feel the tension. You know that you should intervene. You think you might even know how, but you don't. Mm-hmm. And my experience there is that I'm actually afraid. Mm-hmm. And my fear response is probably stronger than needed in the circumstance, but the nervous system is sort of overriding my ability to make a choice in that moment. And so I think that the awareness of neuroscience and the way neurosystems function can open a doorway for a leader to say to themselves, I want to intervene, but I'm not. And then there's one more layer. Why am I not intervening? Oh, mm-hmm. I feel I'm aware of my nervous system, and what my nervous system is feeling is fear. Okay. Mm-hmm. Is the fear helping me, or do I really need to be afraid? No, I don't. I actually can do this. But if you don't have that moment of like questioning what's going on inside your own nervous system, you're probably, and I've experienced this personally, just going to wait till this moment passes. Yeah. And what I think ends up happening is you've just lost an opportunity for connection and coherence with your team. And as a leader, you've missed an opportunity to like say what's going on in the room and help people understand each other better. Because mm-hmm. it's those moments of conflict that actually create connection among your team members and on the team. So if you miss those really sticky opportunities because your nervous system is overriding, then you're missing opportunities to make a richer environment, which, I always talk about how a connected environment feels good. People like going to work when they like their colleagues and feel connected to them. But it's actually a performance strategy, because people do better work when they are invested in the relationships they have and they understand their role and they feel a sense of belonging in their organization. So I think of this sort of nervous system awareness as a strategic advantage, not just like a human sort of nice to have piece to leadership.
Yeah. That's, in the military, they always say, have people receive this sense of responsibility in everything they do, from the lowest ranking individual to the highest ranking in your area. Because when someone feels a sense of responsibility, like they're responsible for the success of something, it gives them that motivation, of course. And all of the things you've said are right on point with that. I'm sorry to interrupt. What practical changes do you think a leader could make once they understand what you've just said?
Well, I mean, I always think of this as practice and skill. So, and humility is the third piece. So, in order to have nervous system awareness, you don't have to become a neuroscientist. You don't have to know a lot. You have to have some basic awareness that it is there. And then one of the things that I think is really important is practicing your own ability to be aware of where you are, because the characteristic of the nervous system is it just takes over and you're not really even sure. You might vaguely know it's uncomfortable, but you're kind of, when it's activated, not fully aware. So for me, and everybody has their own practices, but practice means meditation. So like, and I'm not like a solid meditator. I know it's a good tool and I rely on it. I don't do it every day. I do it as much as I can, but just knowing that, like, that ability to kind of tune into what's happening, and knowing the practice that you can use to be able to have that tune in capacity. So for some people, it's going for a walk or crochet or whatever. It's any kind of thing that lets you slow down and tune in. And it doesn't happen in the moment. It happens before you get to the moment, because it's the thing that helps you know what's going on. And so that's the practice piece. The skill piece is sort of, it's like understanding effective listening and effective communication. These are great tools. They really help you navigate conflict with some skill. And I think just like basic active listening and nonviolent communication skills are fantastic there. And sometimes you get into a situation that is sticky and you don't know how to navigate it, even if you have taken some workshops on skill building for communication. And then I think the idea is to rely on humility. And that what that looks like is just like, I'm noticing some tension in the room and I'd like to help us name it, but I'm not really sure where to start. Can we take a pause and or does this resonate with everybody? Can we take a pause and sort of check in with what's happening right now for everybody? And that ability to say, I feel something and I don't know what it is in that's how I approach these things. And I love what you shared about sort of like everybody in the organization through all ranks sort of having this mindset, because it's a lot to ask the person who's at the top of a hierarchy to always be able to access their full capacity to cut through their nervous system response and show up fully. And that point really underlines the fact that leadership is not a role. It's a way of being, and anybody in the room can take on that leadership position, but in the sense of noticing what's happening and having the courage, skill, or humility to name it. And that can bring connection for everybody. And it doesn't have to come from the person who's like supposedly at the top of the hierarchy. It can come from anybody.
That's a great comment that you just made. Certainly will be something we quote as we move forward, because I think too few people think that. They think that it's a role. It is definitely a way of being and how we are. And if neuroscience is really changing how we understand leadership behavior, then it really begs the question about whether traditional leadership models that we've been taught, I know from my experience, are still applicable, because many leadership models were developed during the times when we had relative stability. And today, more than ever, leaders are operating in environments where it's defined by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and the traditional command and control approach doesn't really work out. It's struggling. Where do you see traditional models failing when the complexity of these environments start to increase?
Yeah, so the traditional models, so-called, I mean, I think people have been doing leadership in all kinds of ways for all kinds of, for time immemorial. But the command and control sort of method, this idea that the leader is going to have all the answers and everyone needs to wait for it. First of all, I think that creates burnout in leaders and it creates a lot of pressure. The idea that you would know all the answers for a large organization all the time is it's a lot to ask somebody, but it's also super limiting. You have, if you have an organization of 150 people and there's only one person who's really calling the shots, independently, you're missing out on a lot of your intelligence, right? So when I think about moving into complexity, I think about how an environment where everybody is engaged in the environment, engaged in the challenges or the problems, engaged in the vision, having a very clear sense of what the vision is. And so when I say that, it's like organizations do these retreats and the leadership team will make a vision and then it'll be handed on to the team and nothing further happens. But what I see is more like a collective articulation of a vision where like everybody in the organization knows what every word means, right? And not only that, but they know where they fit into it. And in the process of doing that work, as an example, connections are built and people start to understand their role, but they also understand the people that they're working with and their role and the talents of the people that they're working with. So it's really about finding those moments where you can build connection and you can build engagement and accountability in every person in the organization, so that when a moment of complexity or change arises and a difficult decision has to be made by the leader, well, at least everybody understands where the decision is coming from, even if they don't like it, right? So if everybody knows where you're going and you make a decision, you say, I'm making this decision, it was based on these values that we articulated. It's like the buy-in is already built in. And it's because you've created a groundwork where everyone feels like they're part of something. And I think one of the things that we get into this sort of spin in complex and rapidly changing environments where organizations are needing to adapt very quickly. And there's what ends up happening is a bit of a panic response. And that can be, by default, command and control leadership can start to come into play because there's a sense that things need to be done really quickly. And what I've experienced is if you just invest a little bit of time up front, it doesn't have to be a lot. In terms of setting the stage for where you're going, it actually saves you so much time in pulling through that change because everybody's working for it and everybody understands their role in it. Yeah,
absolutely. I totally agree with that. I've found more success in telling people why we're doing stuff than just to do it. They need to know the intent. And I think it's really important. And more often than not, when traditional models kind of start to break down in leadership and a leader finds themselves encountering stress, they find themselves doing so in a way they maybe weren't prepared for. And this idea, I'm going to talk about trauma-informed leadership here, has been really gaining attention in fields like healthcare and education and some other places. But in an institutional environment, a leader will still struggle to understand what that actually means in practice. And so how does a trauma-informed approach change the way that leaders would manage conflict and stress?
Yeah. And I think trauma is a word that is used a lot and possibly not well understood. And by everybody, and it's also an important word. And I think we, in a leadership context, need to be careful with it because we have people around us with all kinds of experiences. What I think of when I think about trauma informed, what I'm really thinking about is actually understanding that everybody is coming to the table with their own experience, their own processing, their own triggers, and that they're not just responding to what's happening, but they're responding through their nervous system interpretation of what's happening. And I think that there's often an interpretation of behavior that could be more informed by nervous system awareness, or could be more trauma informed, where we take a moment to not draw conclusions about the behavior we're seeing. Instead, we speak to somebody whose behavior is maybe causing us to draw our own conclusion and get inside of what's happening for that person. And that doesn't have to be like unpacking their trauma. It can be, I'm noticing that you're less engaged in meetings these days. Does that sound accurate to you? And is there something going on? Is there something I can do? Rather than that person's checked out, they're change resistant, there's nothing, their performance is slacking. So I think when I think about trauma informed, what I'm really thinking about is not jumping to conclusions about the behavior that we're seeing in front of us, and instead just having a conversation about it. It's quite simple. And what I like about that is anybody can do it. You don't need to be trauma informed to have a heart-centered approach to understanding the people in front of you.
Yeah. The ones that, and when I say ones, I mean leaders. I've seen this before, and I'm sure you have as well, that just go right into reactionary mode. In fact, I'm probably going to talk about this in just a few minutes. But when you go into that reactionary mode, you're almost always wrong about the situation in which you're trying to deal with. You think, even in normal day life, if you make assumptions right off the bat about something, it tends to usually be at least not 100% correct. And it creates a bit more problems than you're probably could have dealt with if you went with a heart-centered approach, as you mentioned. And you've introduced another framework that helps leaders understand what those internal tensions can be or how to handle them in a different way. And I think you called it the internal family system. Is that correct?
Yeah. So internal family systems is a psychology framework just developed by Richard Schwartz. And so it is a framework to help us understand the parts inside of us that might be activated at any given moment. So he's a family psychotherapist, and he works with families. So what he would notice is in a room with a family in it, the father would react in a certain way, and that would make the mother react. The father would scold the child, and then the mother would come in and defend the child, for example. And so he noticed this dynamic happening in the families he was working with, and started to investigate, well, what's happening inside one individual? And noticing that there's a family system inside of every individual. So there's parts inside of every person that, there's a part of me who will scold me for not doing an Instagram post today. And then there's another part of me that is upset at the part of me that's upset for not doing it. So there's a bit of a war inside of me between my own parts that is kind of wasting my energy. right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've got two parts inside of me that are fighting over something, trying to protect some other piece inside of me. And so I'm not able to focus my energy in a constructive way. And so people talk about parts work. And that's investigating these parts inside of yourself. Internal family systems is one modality of parts work. But so yeah, that's a kind of an introduction to what IFS is referring to as a methodology.
And that raises a real practical challenge for leaders that are operating under pressure, because understanding the environment, understanding what things we're dealing with individually, can help alleviate, or it can create more pressure. You've mentioned before that leaders almost always move directly into reaction mode without really doing any analysis. And in these environments where they're complex or high stakes, that shift can be real subtle, but it's consequential. And it can affect the way we judge, it can affect how we communicate, and it can affect team dynamics overall. How do you recommend that leaders recognize when they're operating from a reactionary state rather than from a point of clarity?
Well, I think parts work is one modality that you can use to just sort of, I kind of think of it as like having a flashlight, and you're like going inside of your own sort of operating system, your nervous system, and the way you react to situations, and shining a bit of light on it to see how it is working. And so this methodology is one of the flashlights you can use to get in there, so that when you are in a situation where you're kind of triggered, like when I say that, for me, what that looks like is I'm in a meeting and my heart's racing and I don't know what to do. And I feel like I'm supposed to do something and I don't know what to do. Right. And so, it often comes up in conflict for me, because conflict makes me feel afraid. My nervous system becomes activated. So it's when you take a flashlight in and you understand more about what triggers you, then when the trigger is happening, you're like, oh, right, this is this moment, this conflict moment where I get afraid and I kind of shut down. And so it helps you be aware of what's happening in that moment so that you can decide, oh, right, this is not how I want to handle this. I don't want to back away from this. I want to create a moment of connection in this room. So I'm going to notice my trigger and like understand what's happening inside of me to allow me to move through it. I don't want to say push through it, because you want to be careful with your nervous system, but allow yourself to move through it so that you can show up for the people in the room with you. So I talked about meditation as a practice that helps you tune in and notice. And I think parts work is another modality where you can understand that, like you can identify the moments that are going to make you activate.
This metacognitive practice is difficult. It's very difficult, at least in my opinion, because I have been talking about metacognitive practices and applications on how to put a pause between an event and your response for years. For 20 years, I've been talking about this stuff, to both in my military career and commercial career. And I tell you, Gillian, I still mess it up. I still get to the point where I will react. And it happened a year ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. And I think that's really important things of what you said. And when leaders begin to recognize those reactive patterns, the more they practice, it really kind of starts to open up a broader question about the systems that they're operating within. And systems thinking is kind of where I want to go with it. It challenges the assumption that problems are caused primarily by individuals. Rather, it suggests that behavior can often emerge as a result of the way that an organization is structured, or the incentives or lack of are within that organization.
So when I think about different frameworks for understanding the systems you are in, And there's a number of them. I like the Kniffen framework, where you can understand different kinds of environments and what is needed of them. So if you are in a simple environment where you know what you're building and everybody knows how to do it. It's very straightforward, and you don't need to worry about a lot of complexity. But you move through different layers of complexity. So there's like simple environments, there's complicated environments, there's complex environments, and there's chaotic environments. And each of these environments requires a different mindset, an approach of the people within it, and in particular, the leaders. So that systems thinking frameworks can help you identify what kind of environment you're in and what is the best response for you, or what's the mindset you should be bringing to actions in that environment. I also, talking about neurodivergence, this has been my flashlight on systems, because I can study frameworks for systems thinking and understand theoretically what they mean. But my experience with neurodivergence has really helped me understand the way systems are keeping certain people, are limiting the capacity of certain people in the system, because the system has a way of operating. And my example about HR accommodations is sort of a good example when you're dealing with neurodivergent staff, because the rules are there to make it easy, to make it fair, to make it consistent, and to make it efficient, right? And there's probably all kinds of other reasons that I'm not an accommodation specialist. So there's probably things I'm missing there. But that is a system designed to address neurodivergent needs in an organization. But the system is designing them so that the neurodivergent people can fit into the dominant system, rather than having, as we were saying before, having that, seeing the value that person might be bringing. I always like to say, more than a seat at the table, I'd like to know what's happening over at your table, right? When I think about neurodivergence in systems. So I think that we need systems. They help us interact. They help us get through our days. And a lot of the times we're not really aware of them. We go into work and we're not really thinking about the policies that are governing the way we're operating, or the way the workplace is governing, or the way the culture is governing, how we show up, how we feel, how we act. And I think systems awareness is just this another piece that can help you understand what is going into the dynamic that might be influencing the nervous systems in the room, right? So that you can have more clarity, more anchor, and more ability to navigate it with skill.
Yeah, you talk about the one-way direction, if you will, of the way these systems kind of go, that they typically force the neurodivergent individuals to conform to this grander system that we're on. Why do you think organizations default to fixing people instead of looking at the system that they're in and trying to change that?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. Well,
besides the fact that it's probably very difficult to change systems, but
well, I mean, the systems are built by and for, largely by and for, specific neurotypes. So the neurotype that we might describe as neurotypical, the systems are built by those neurotypes. So, and it's the dominant neurotype. So we can talk about the origins of the concept of normal, right? That would be a whole tangent I could go on. I'm not sure I'll take us there necessarily, but it's a concept, right? It's not, we weren't born with the idea of normal,
right?
But it is a value, or it's an idea that infiltrates our systems. And when you show up in your workplace and a specific job is done a particular way, it's just assumed that this is how you do it. And the idea that there could be other ways to do it, it requires actually kind of breaking the mold, which is not that, it's not that easy. And the whole system is propped up around, like, that little system of how you do that job is sitting inside of this other system, sitting inside this other system. So, and I want to name, we didn't really talk about this before, but leaders and everybody in their workplaces these days, I think that work is changing and people are facing complexity and they've got a lot to do. Mm-hmm. So when someone starts to pick apart the system, it feels like something else to face, and mm-hmm. it feels big and confusing. And you don't really know how to navigate it or where to start. So I think that, that's kind of the bigger picture of why we don't really address our systems. But I think at the micro level, it's kind of just that we're not really aware of them as we move through our days. We really have to sit down and think about the system you're in and how it's impacting you and others around you in order to be aware of it. Because I don't really think that, people who are part of the dominant type experience the system in the way that people who are not part of the dominant type.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question kind of had an underlying tone of transition, and systems pressures often become really, really visible when leaders go through transition, especially major ones. And leadership roles often do come with this identity transition. People move from expert to executive. They might move from operator to strategist. They might move from one field and work to a profession to another. They might move down the ladder some. And those shifts can really challenge the leader's sense of competence and self-definition, how they see themselves in an environment. And when leaders go through identity or career transitions, what are some of the psychological risks that they might underestimate? So,
I think change is hard for everyone. Mm-hmm. There are some people who are more comfortable with change than others, but I think that any kind of new environment is going to challenge your identity. It's going to, for many people, experience a sense of imposter syndrome or mm-hmm. imposter state, I think is probably a more accurate way of describing it, where they do not necessarily feel like they belong or they have earned or that they know what they're doing to be in this position, which can really kind of get in the way sometimes of being fully present, mm-hmm. right? So I think one of the things that leaders, as they move into new roles, want to do is understand where they are and understand that they're human and that everyone around them also sees them as human. I think a lot of leaders come in and they think, okay, I've been given this, let's say it's a promotion, I've been given this opportunity and I came from, coming from the outside, especially, no one knows me. I have to prove myself. Mm-hmm. But that can look like all kinds of things, but it often, just that idea of having to prove yourself is, it's like stepping out of who you really are because you're trying to show somebody something specific about you. Mm-hmm. Whereas, allowing a team to educate you on how things work is a really great way to build trust, but it also takes the pressure off of you as a new leader moving through an identity change to have all the answers. So I think it's really a win-win to just navigating those transitions, to just kind of hold things loosely and let yourself be a human being and let yourself not have the answers and to learn and be curious. And I say win-win because it builds trust while also not needing you to be the person with all the answers all the time.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And so many managers assume that burnout, constant urgency, having the phone with you all the time, these long hours are really just part of the job. And I thought that. and many people suggest that effective leadership doesn't require that. That structural changes can be made to make it possible. Are there any of those structural changes that you can think of that would make it possible?
Well, I think that at the systems level, probably, but in terms of what a leader can do about it, I think probably the most important thing for a leader to be able to access, especially when they're new, is their capacity for presence, because they need to take in a lot. And they need to sense their team, their challenges. You want to be in a state where you're able to receive a lot of information. And if you are in a state where you're rushing or chronic urgency, or you think you're putting yourself under a lot of pressure to learn it all right away, or your organization is in a state of constant complexity and challenge, if you react to that pressure, your capacity for presence is reduced. And in order to bring regulation and clarity and alignment to what you are doing, what your organization is doing, and what the people in your organization are doing, you need to be able to sense. So I think leaders need to understand what they need to do for themselves in order to maintain presence. And to understand that as part of their job, right? So, in my case, for example, I need to exercise. And when I exercise, all of the ideas that are, feeling, all the challenges that are feeling intractable resolve while I'm running. So I started to consider running part of my job, because that's where I was doing all of the best problem solving, was out on a run. And there's what I needed to do in order to access that was to give myself permission to go for a run at lunchtime instead of working through lunch. And that's not a big boundary. That's a pretty human boundary. And I did have to give myself permission to do that, to say, no, actually my health is part of my job description as a leader. So I think when I think about structural changes and what leaders can do right away, it's understanding what you need to be able to have access to your full capacity and your full presence, and then giving yourself that. And I say that like it sounds like it's easy. When you have a very busy day and a very busy week, it is really hard to make that space.
Yeah.
And that's why that switch to understanding that this is part of what you're paid to do, I think is a one way that you can offer yourself permission to make that space for your own presence.
And rather than thinking of those things, somebody will say, oh, exercise is a simplistic thing, but it's just one more thing I'm going to have to do during my day, and I've got to find the time to do it, rather than taking the perspective as you have, which is, this is a lifestyle change. This is what I do. This is part of the entire package. It's just not one additional thing that I'm going to be adding to that. And that kind of brings me to this larger organizational implication of the work that you're doing. If ideas like neurodiversity, aware leadership, of trauma-informed systems, of neuroscience-informed decision-making became widely adopted, the structure of many organizations would look much different than it does today. If an organization adopted neurodiversity-aware principles broadly, I guess, what would be some of the major changes that one might see in an organization?
Well, my mission is really kind of like at a societal level, but I think you can do this in the microcosm of an organization. There's just a few basic things that I think people need in order to be able to meet each other fully. And one is, when we're talking about neurodivergence in particular, one is like a little bit of knowledge about what these profiles mean and what it means to live with them. I think we're moving into a time where the idea of neurodivergence is changing. I think we're moving away from the idea that this is a pathology or something wrong with you, and into an era where we understand these are different ways of processing. And I think we need to increase everyone's basic knowledge of what this means. So that's the first thing, a little bit of information. And then I think the other thing is to start to have those practice-based approaches, to prioritize practice-based approaches to leadership and to neurodivergence in general, rather than policy-based approaches. So rather than being a leader who is faced with a problem and has to call HR to get my solution that doesn't really work,
right,
trying to build a culture where we actually have the conversation at the beginning. We invest an hour of our time in understanding what is needed for success for this person in this job up front, and to save us a lot of time on the back end. And part of that, as I mentioned before, is making openness around neurodiversity status safe for everybody. The idea that there is a risk in that, but not understanding the potential value in that openness, I think is one of the missing pieces. So if I am aware that an incoming team member is neurodivergent, well, okay, I'm going to want to know what they need to be successful, but I also want to know what they're capable of that might be unique. And there are people who have a much stronger sense for pattern recognition and sensing into the future and processing information in ways that I and other people on my team might not have access to. And how might that be of benefit to the organization generally? And I think that's the piece that we need to talk about more, because it makes disclosing your neurodivergent status not just not risky, but actually maybe valuable for everybody. And I think that's where we want to move in terms of structural changes and understanding what this really means to have different ways of processing information and communicating in our world. Specifically understanding that there's a value there that we are missing out on. And I want to see us all move towards harnessing that value.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Totally agree with you on that one, both from experience and just from what we talk about with different guests, including yourself, about how powerful people can be. And leadership is often framed around this idea of strategy and authority and results. And what you've helped highlight today is that the quality of leadership also depends on something much, much deeper, which is our awareness of how people actually think, how they respond to pressure, how they respond inside complex systems. And the work that you've been doing really brings together the neuroscience, systems thinking, trauma-informed practices in a way that challenges us to think about how we lead. It's not just simply to get others to perform better, but to also lead with clarity, alignment, and responsibility. And I think real conversations like this one expand on helping us understand what effective leadership really looks like. And for that, I certainly want to thank you for your conversation today. I, for one, can exemplify that you're absolutely right. And having the diversity in a workplace is far more powerful than trying to have others conform to what you think it should be. So thank you again for joining me today. I really do appreciate your time and the insights you provided. Of course, we'll have links to everything that you've done and all of your work in the show notes. Any last parting thoughts before we close out?
No, just it's been a real pleasure talking with you today, and thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Anytime. Thank you so much.
Take care.